Let's understand better what's the relationship between God and morality through a theory that I'm trying to formulate called synthetic divine command theory. My name is Bruno Sankey or Bruno dos Santos Queiroz. I'm here at the Wehiro Oxford Institute. I'm at Oxford as a visiting student for some months, and I'd like to share my view, the thesis I'm developing, which is about a specific formulation of the synthetic divine command theory that I'm proposing. Uh, then I will explain what it is, what's the theory I'm formulating. Actually, the theory is kind of my thesis. Then my thesis consists in constructing a synthetic divine command theory, or I will call it SDCT, because we have a lot of formulations of divine command theory. We have some types of modified divine command theory, but I'm trying something more ambitious. It's more than just a modified divine command theory, which you can find in literature, like in Robert Adams or William Lane Craig. Um, the theory I'm trying to formulate is more complex. It's not just a modified divine command theory, but it is a synthetic divine command theory because I'm trying to create a framework which integrates different elements of metaethics, axiology, and normative ethics in a common theory. Then my thesis consists in constructing a synthetic divine command theory, SDCT, as an integrated metaethical framework combining elements of divine command theory, ethical rationalism, and natural law theory. As you can see, it's not just formulating a synthetic or a modified divine command theory, but a theory that could give us answers for problems in axiology, ontology, semantics, then normativity. Then its goal is to create a more philosophically resilient model of moral normativity, one capable of addressing traditional objections to divine command theory and explaining both the meaning, the nature, the ground of moral judgments. SDCT integrates contribution from cognitivist expressivism, non-naturalist non-realism, theistic projectivism, moderate theological voluntarism, Aristotelian perfectionist axiology, and the promulgation-based natural law. Uh, as you can see, there are a lot of things, but the reason is that I'm trying to create a complete framework. I will explain these elements. We have 6 elements here. Then I would say that the synthetic divine command theory has 6 components. We are going through a overview of the divine command theory, which will be the first part of the video. Then after this, we have more 6 parts addressing each component of the synthetic divine command theory I'm formulating. The 6 components are here, as you can see. Then we have cognitivist expressivist, non-naturalist non-realism, theistic projectivism, moderate theological voluntarism, Aristotelian perfectionist axiology, and promulgation-based law theory. Let me just go through these problems. Let's start with the overall view of the synthetic divine command theory before engaging with the components. Then, this is the first part of the video about overview of synthetic divine command theory. The synthetic divine command theory is conceived as a proposal for an integrated metaethical theory, whose aim is to reconcile the central concepts of the divine command theory, GCT, with sophisticated perspectives from contemporary metaethics, semantics, axiology, and epistemology. In doing so, the SDCT seeks to preserve the authority of God in morality while responding to classical criticism directed as at DCT, such as arbitrariness and moral subjectivism. I don't know if you've heard of it, but the classical divine command theory has a lot of problems, especially concerning arbitrariness. If God's commands are the source of morality, then God could command anything. If God creates what's right and wrong, he could somehow commands cruelty or torture, then it's a form actually of subjectivism. A lot of many people believe that divine command theory is important to ground objective morality, but that's not true actually, because if morality relies in God's commands, then this is not a form of objectivism, but subjectivism, because morality relies on the will of a specific subject. Then my formulation of divine command theory seeks to avoid these problems. The SDCT's framework is grounded in several fundamental assumptions that guide its theoretical structure. The first assumption of SDCT is the divine preference as criterion. This will be very important because we have a theory of divine preference. It's the rational divine preference theory, according to which good is determined by the preferences of God, and these preferences are rational. Here, this is not the theory I'm adopting. Actually, I'm adopting the theory of divine preference as criterion. It's different. Divine preferences criterion establishes that if God exists as an omniscient being, the creator of the universe with purpose and reasons, and cares about the well-being of creatures, then his preference constitutes the ultimate standard for evaluating the correctness or rationality of human preferences, as well as determining the value of actions and objects. Then it's not that divine preferences creates what is good, but it is the criterion to identify, evaluate what's good. According to the theory of divine preference as a criterion of rational correction, divine preferences are considered rational in a procedural sense because God is a fully informed being whose cognitive faculties function properly. This should be understood metaphorically. However, since God is a being of pure intellect who apprehends all truths simultaneously rather than a rational agent in the ordinary sense, we need to think about this as a metaphor. Divine preference derives from a perfect and fully informed consciousness of the objective goods of the world, which in turn are understood as finite expressions of God's infinite or infinite perfections. This is something that will become clear while we are developing the theory. In what sense uh, God's infinity perfections are resembled in the human nature, and how human nature is the ground of morality, and how God desires the good of humans' nature, and this desire is God's will, which desires the flourishment of human beings. All this relationship will, I think, become clear along this video. But the important thing here is that the divine rational preference work as a regulative ideal for the correction of human preference if God is omniscient and if he thinks properly. This approach does not focus on what constitutes the ultimate good. This is very important. God desires something because this thing is good. It's not that something is good and God desires. It's not that something is good because God desires it. Then in the Uchifron dilemma, I would choose the hard, which says that God desires something because this thing is good. God desires are rational, and God desires what is good in itself. When I say that we need to take on our account the rational desires of God, it's not because the rational desires of God determines what is good. It's because they can be a regulative ideal to identify what's good because God desires what is good. Second, the SDCT defends sufficiency rather than necessity of moral obligation. I believe that moral obligation is grounded on our reason. Our reason is enough to justify morality or moral obligation. For example, if someone asks me, why should I accept that 2 plus 2 equals 4? The only thing that would be something that it would be a sufficient answer would be something like you should accept that 2 plus 2 equals 4 because this is what reason requires from you. The same thing applies to morality. If someone asks me, why should I do the right thing? I can simply answer because this is what reason requires you to do. This theory is called the theory of the dictum of reason. However, I believe that the answer could also be because God requires it from you. In this case, this answer would be also sufficient. Then we have two possible answers about the justification of moral action. We can say that someone has to do what is right because it is what reason requires from this person. I could also say that someone should do what's right or ought to do what's right because God requires it. Both answers are sufficient to ground moral obligation. Then God's commandments are understood as sufficient conditions for moral obligation, but not necessary. Because if someone answers that reason requires something, it would be okay to answer this. It is an enough justification because that's why God's command is not the exclusive prerequisites. This position allows moral duties to be recognized and justified even in the absence of belief in God, provide an elegant solution to so-called atheist virtuoso problem. What is the atheist virtuoso problem? It is the fact that even atheists have insufficient moral justification for their actions. Accordingly, the theory ensures that morality retains consistency and rationality independently of explicit religious adherence, while preserving divine authority as a normative reference. Finally, the SDCT emphasized the nature of divine commands, maintaining that they are grounded in the recognition of the inherent good of creation rather than in arbitrary or capricious decisions. I believe that God's nature is good and that all the creation is an imitation or it resembles God's nature. As God's nature is good, the creation is also good because the creation resembles God's nature. Then there is a rational order in the universe, and this rational order is good. Everything has an end, and everything has a place in this order. And God's commands are conceived as instruments for guiding human beings toward the fulfillment of their goods, of their own nature, and the realization of the good due to them. Everything has an end, and this end is the good of this thing, is the good due to this thing. In this way, the SDCT combines the normative dimensions of divine authority with a rational and teleological understanding of morality, offering an approach that is simultaneously theological, ethical, and epistemically grounded. Of course, the things I said in this first part will become clear along the video while I'm explaining the components of the SDCT. Then let's start with the first component in the second part of the video, which is about the cognitivist expressivism. Cognitivist expressivism is a position in metaethics which holds that moral judgments have a dual aspect. First, they express beliefs which can be true or false, and they also express feelings, attitudes, and prescriptions, which can be appropriate or inappropriate, and both aspects can be judged, evaluated according to objective standards. Then the first component of SDCT is a cognitivist expressivist, a hybrid metaethical approach that seeks to reconcile elements of cognitivism and non-cognitivism. This perspective holds that moral judgments have a dual aspect. They simultaneously express a belief that can be true or false, the cognitivist aspect, and an attitude or normative commitment that can be evaluated as appropriate or inappropriate, as correct or incorrect. This is the expressivist aspect, with both aspects be accessible according to objective standards. For example, when I evaluate a question, I can evaluate if it's a good question or a bad question according to objective standards, even though I'm not talking about truth. Here, I will maintain the idea of truth to the cognitive elements, but there is another sense according to which we can also evaluate the expressivist component, which is not exactly about truth, but about appropriate or being appropriate or inappropriate. In the cognitivist component, moral judgments are understood as propositions that can be true or false and that express irreducible normative reasons. These truths cannot be fully reduced to natural facts, but can be evaluated through the proper use of reason, employing methods such as reflective equilibrium or critical thinking. There is a sense that I'm a naturalist, but it's in the Aristotelian sense because I believe morality is grounded in human nature. But in the sense, I'm talking about metaphysics, about the end of human nature. However, if we are talking about nature in the modern sense, which is the object or subject of an ideal natural science, I'm not a naturalist. I don't believe moral proprieties can be reduced to natural proprieties. Well, then moral proprieties cannot be further reduced to natural facts in the sense of the empirical facts or facts about the natural world. But in some sense, we could say that morality is grounded or emerges from human's nature in the metaphysical sense. It will be clear when I explain the axiology I follow. By incorporating this aspect, the SDCT ensures that moral judgments are not mere appearances or arbitrary expressions, but rationally justifiable normative beliefs, aligned with the objective structure of morality. The truth of the cognitive element is related to non-naturalist, non-realist moral proprieties. The expressivist aspect, on the other hand, recognizes that moral judgments involve emotional response and normative attitudes in addition to cognitive elements. When declared an action to be right or wrong, the agent not only believes a moral proposition, but also manifests an appropriate emotional response, such as obedience, disapproval, or approval. That's why moral judgments cannot be simple propositions. If I have a proposition like this chair is blue, all you need to do is to accept this proposition if the chair is really blue. However, moral judgments are different. When I say mothering is wrong, it's not enough that you reply me saying that you agree or that you accept the truth that mother is wrong. The judgment, mother is wrong, requires from you more than just accepting the truth of this proposition. It requires you to stop murdering or never murdering. No murder. It requires you action. It requires you an emotional response. If you have murdered, you need to feel guilt. Then moral judgments are more than just propositions. They have a cognitive element, but they also have an expressivist element. An element related to obedience, disapproval, approval. This dimension or dimension of moral judgment is crucial for understanding how moral values and norms are integrated into practical life, guiding both feelings and behavior. It also reflects or it also relates to the fact that we project our attitudes both onto the natural world and for theists onto God commands. I will explain it better. It's about the taste to projectivism, but I believe that moral judgments have this dual aspect. When we are talking about the cognitive aspect, we need a non-naturalist, non-realist theory about the truth of these cognitive elements related to the moral properties. And we also have this expressivist component, we can which can be explained by crazy realism and projectivism, and in the case of divine command theory, with theistic projectivism. It's another component that I will explain afterwards. But let's start with the non-naturalist, non-realism component, which relates to the cognitivist element. What is what is non-naturalist, non-realism? Let's go to the third part of the video and let's talk about the second element of SDCT. The second component of the SDCT is non-naturalist, non-realism, also known as non-descriptivist cognitivism, which adopts a perspective holding that moral judgments express beliefs that can be true or false, but whose truth does not depend on the existence of properties or facts in a strong ontological sense. Here, therefore, I avoid the critics against the objective of morality regarding the queerness of moral properties. Because I'm saying that moral truths do not depend on queerness or on queer moral properties. These truths are considered reducible, objective, and non-natural, analogous to logical and mathematical truths. This approach provides the SDCT with an objective and non-arbitrary foundation for divine morality, allowing moral judgments to be genuinely true without appealing to strange, queer metaphysical entities, thereby limiting what God can command in a way that is coherent with moral rationality. Within the framework of cognitivism, non-naturalist and non-realism holds that moral judgments express beliefs with truth value, distinguishing it from non-cognitivist theories such as emotivism or classical prescriptivism, which view moral judgments merely as expressions of emotions or commands without propositional content. Although moral judgments express true beliefs, are not all moral judgments are I'm talking about the moral judgments which are true. They can express true or false beliefs, but if they are correct, they express true beliefs. Non-realism maintains that their truth does not depend on concrete properties or facts in a strong ontological sense. While physical or psychological properties have concrete existence and causal efficacy, I would say that if you have a non-naturalist view, you would also say that spiritual properties or angels or demons can also have this concrete existence and causal efficacy. I would also say that God has concrete existence and causal efficacy. That's why it doesn't make sense that to say that God is good in the moral sense, because God has causal efficacy, but moral goodness maybe not. Um, Moral facts exist analogously to logical or mathematical facts. For example, if I say that the number 2 is the only even prime number, I'm saying that the number 2 has the property of being the only even prime number. But in this case, I'm not saying that this property is outside us, that this property is ontologically have. I'm just saying that there's this kind of number 2. I'm not exactly sure about what it is, but I'm trying to avoid Platonic consequence. But we can talk about truth in math, we can talk about truth in logic without implying the existence of unsubstantial metaphysical entity. This perspective allows the SDCT to affirm the existence of objective moral truths without appealing to a robust ontology of strange moral entities in the world. For example, there is a philosopher here in Oxford called David Enoch, and he believes in a robust realism. I'm here trying to reject this form of realism and trying to defend a objective sense of moral truth without appealing to robust realism. I'm also trying to reject the simple expressivist idea that the truth of moral judgments are just like expression of attitudes. What I'm trying to defend is that there are some types of truth which do not depend on strong moral entities or strong ontological entities. They are true in a different sense as the proposition the chair is blue is true. I'm appealing to a pluralist alectic model, or which is the position that true is something that can have many different meanings. Something can be true in different ways. Something can be true because it corresponds to external reality. But something can also be true in the sense that reality needs to correspond to this truth. This is the case of necessary truth. A necessary truth is not a truth about the external reality in the sense that this truth needs to correspond to external reality. However, what it's really the case, it's that necessary truth are truths according to which the external reality needs to be conformed. External reality conforms to necessary truth. It's not the truth that needs to correspond to reality. It's reality that needs to correspond with these truths. That's the case of necessary truths. These are the truths of math, logic, and morality. The moral truths recognized by SDCT, let me here again. The moral truths recognized by the SDCT have three essential characteristics. First, these truths are reducible. Then the first characteristic is irreducibility. Normativity properties cannot be reduced to natural or descriptive properties. Even a complete factual description does not by itself determine what one ought to do. Even if we had a complete description of the natural world, we would never know how to imply normative properties. Natural world has no normative property. However, I follow a type of naturalism in another sense, which is a metaphysical naturalism based on the theology of perfect being and the Aristotelian perfectionism, but I will explain it afterwards. The second characteristic of the SDCT is the objectivity. Moral truths are universal, not just universal, they are objective, which means that they do not depend on the particular opinions or feelings of subjects or individuals or cultures. These truths exist independently of human attitudes, feelings, or conventions. They are not determined by humans' opinions. In some sense, I would say that moral truths depend on the human nature, but no, not in the human's opinions or beliefs or feelings. Then they determine how things ought to be for moral action to be rationally possible. The third characteristic of moral truths is that they are non-natural. Then it's non-naturalness. Fundamental moral truths are necessary and non-natural. For example, the truth that you cannot cause uh, suffer for pleasure and just the truth that you cannot be cruel just for pleasure, that you should not torture a child for divertment, for fun. These are necessary truths, like in math, like in logic. For example, the proposition that undeserved suffering is wrong holds true in all possible roles. I'm here just using an example. I know that there are some discussions about this undeserved suffering. Of course, I'm using this example, but I'm not like committing with particular practical or normative consequence. Just here to say that if there are necessary moral truths, if there are fundamental moral truths, then they are not necessary. Then they are necessary and not natural. The adoption of non-naturalist, non-realism is a crucial to resolving the problem of arbitrariness in voluntarist divine command theory. Because moral truths are logically necessary, not even God's will can alter them. God cannot alter necessary mathematical truths. God cannot say that 2 plus 2 equals 5. In the same way, God cannot alter moral truths because they are logically necessary or they are necessary. Maybe we would not say logically, it depends on the way we are talking, but they are necessary. I prefer removing logically. It's better to say just necessary because it can be misleading. Maybe you can think that logically means conceptual, but this is not the case. But because moral truths are necessary, not even God's will can alter them. God therefore recognizes these moral truths, just as he recognizes necessary logical and mathematical truths, and does not create them arbitrarily. This implies that God cannot command morally wrong actions, ensure that divine commands are perfect expressions of divine moral reason rather than products of arbitrariness. Then we have analyzed the cognitivist part of moral truths. Let's now analyze the expressivist component according to theistic projectivism. Then this is the fourth part of the video, theistic projectivism, and I will talk about the third component of the synthetic divine command theory. The third component of the synthetic divine command theory is theistic projectivism. Projectivism in general in the field of metaethics is a thesis situated within the tradition of expressivism and the anti-realism, holding that moral judgments do not describe objective ontological facts, such as moral proprieties, but rather express attitudes that result from projections onto no moral or natural facts. According to this perspective, our moral response arises as cognitive response, that is, emotional or dispositional reactions to natural facts. A notable prong of this approach is quasi-realism, which explains how moral discourse, by expressing projected attitudes, mimics the language of truth, granting moral judgments a quasi-objective character, even though they are derived from subjective projections. I agree with quasi-realism in rejecting moral realism and viewing the notion of ontological moral proprieties in a strong sense as a concept arising from our projections of moral connotations onto the world. However, I diverge from classical quasi-realism in that I accept a strong sense of moral truth. Theistic projectivism incorporates classical projectivism, extending it to include moral attitudes or moral attitude projections beyond the natural. Thus, theistic projectivism constitutes an extension of the projectivist logic to theistic worldview. It operates under the premise that the cognitive responses we project are not limited to natural properties, but also to supernatural and divine properties. In this context, religious attitudes are not mere psychological constructions. Rather, they constitute responses that can be appropriate or inappropriate to God's commands. Emotions and dispositions such as worship, reverence, fear, love, or obedience are understood as projected responses to a divine entity, reflecting a direct interaction with the sacred. The integration of theistic projectivism into the synthetic divine command theory (SDCT) allows for a current articulation of the relationship between God's will and the moral responses of the agent. The believer's moral judgments express emotional responses appropriate or it can be inappropriate to divine authority and commands, such that moral obedience and ethical action are not reduced to rational understanding alone, but involve a profound emotional response, a deep emotional response, evoking internal dispositions such as reverent fear or unconditional love for God. In this way, the expressivist dimension of moral judgments is theologically grounded, linking the supernatural basis of morality to the agent's emotional and motivational experience. Theistic projectivism seeks to explain the expressivist components by determining that the sentiments or attitudes or feelings expressed by the agents must be correct or appropriate emotional response to the divine command. As I said, even though the expressivist component is not about truth exactly, it can be evaluated according to objective standards. The criterion for assessing this correctness is provided by the theory of rational divine preference, as I said before, which underpins the perfectionist axiology of the SDCT. I will explain afterwards. According to the agent's attitudes are considered accordingly, the agent's attitudes are considered appropriate when aligned with the perfect and morally justified reasons that ground God's commands. This integration allows the SDCT to recognize the cognitive and motivational dimension of morality. The agent's internal disposition to obey arouses from a profound, deep emotional response to divine authority, while simultaneously maintaining the objectivity and the rationality of moral judgment, as the correctness of these attitudes is evaluated according to the rational preference of a perfect God. Let's now talk about the fourth component of SDCT, which is moderate theological voluntarism. The fourth component of the SDCT is moderate theological voluntarism, MTV. MTV. It's cool. It's funny that because we have a TV called MTV, it's easier to remember. But MTV, in its most basic formulation, theological voluntarism in general, not just MTV, but the general theological voluntarism, holds that God's will determines the moral character of certain facts or actions. However, MTV distinguishes itself from radical theological voluntarism, which asserts that all moral commands derive solely from God's free and absolute will. This is the more simple formulation of divine command theory. It's obviously wrong because it's very subjectivist. It falls into arbitrariness. It turns morality like something crazy because God could command cruelty for itself. Then radical theological voluntarism hands morality entirely contingent and potentially arbitrary. To address this issue, MTV introduced a crucial distinction between two types of divine commands. Then we have, according to MTV, two types of divine commands. Necessary moral commands, it's not based in free will, and contingent divine commands. Let's understand the distinction. First, necessary moral commands. Necessary moral commands are grounded in God's essential goodness and nature, and they are therefore independent of his free will. These commands are necessary and immutable, valid in all possible worlds, and directly express the divine nature, which is essentially good, just, and wise. The SDCT maintains that God issues these commands based on the recognition of the do good inherent in creation. Everything has an end. The end of everything is its goodness. Uh, then God desires the good of everything, the good doing to everything, not as a result of arbitrary determination. Consequently, he could not command morally abhorrent actions, such as the torture of innocents, as such acts would be incompatible with his essentially good nature. Examples of such commands include universal duties, like loving God and speaking the truth, which follow naturally from God's loving and truthful essence. I put loving God, but it just in the case that you know God exists and you believe He is good. If you don't believe in God, maybe it's not a requirement for you. It's okay. Second, we have contingent commands. By contrast, contingent commands are those whose validity depends on a contingent order of things that God chooses to establish in the world. These commands are tied to specific institutions, norms, practice, or social organization, such as private property or marriage, so that certain moral obligations derive from concrete structures created by God. Like do not commit adultery is based in the institution of marriage. There is another. It's not arbitrary. It's also moral. But there is a. If there was no structure of marriage, then there would not be no such thing as adultery. I think. But as God created the world in a sense that marriage expresses love and the infidelity, or if you are committed to a relationship or close relationship and you have an agreement with your partner, then this agreement creates moral obligations. Then there are moral obligations which are created according to some institutions. Although contingent and thus potentially different if the words were otherwise, these commands are not arbitrary. Once a specific social or institutional structure is established, the duties that follow from which are rationally and currently determined, ensuring that morality remains non-arbitrary. Furthermore, these commands can encompass both matters of universal morality and norms applicable to specific social or liturgical context. I don't believe I'm kind of a non-religious theist, or no, I follow something called no religious classical theism. I don't believe God requires us to perform rituals or liturgical ceremonies, but if we believe it could be kind of part of these contingent commands. MTV believes that these contingent commands can be based in God's free will, while the necessary commands cannot. MTV preserves moral objectivity by constraining divine will through God's essentially good nature. In this way, God's will is not sovereign to the point of violating his own essence, thereby avoiding arbitrariness. Moreover, the SDCT understand that divine commands are sufficient, but not necessary for moral obligation. They provide normative authority, yet this authority is constrained by the necessary nature of the good. While morality depends on a subject, God, it remains universal since God's nature is immutable and necessary. I'm saying that morality depends on a subject, but I don't believe it exactly this way. I believe that morality indirectly depends on God if He exists. But I will explain it uh, in the last part. Let's now study Aristotle. And in this part, probably about the Aristotelian perfectionist axiology, it should be clear. Let's go to the sixth part and the fifth component, which is Aristotelian perfectionist axiology. The Aristotelian perfectionist axiology, or eudaimonist perfectionism, constitutes a central component of the synthetic divine command theory, responsible for determining what constitutes the ultimate good or non-instrumental value in a still pre-moral sense. It's important to distinguish inherent good and non-instrumental good. Good here is not used in the moral sense, but in the axiological sense. Axiology is previous to morality. Morality is grounded in axiology, but moral good is grounded in axiological good. Axiological good is more fundamental than moral goodness. Then it's important to understand this that I'm talking about good, not in the moral sense, but good in the axiological sense. And it's also important to mention that I'm talking about ultimate good in the sense of non-instrumental good and not in the sense of inherent good. Because G. E. Moore talks about absolute goodness, but what he means is something like good which has value by itself, independent of anything. He means by ultimate good, something like something that is still good, even if isolated of everything else. But I'm not talking about it. I'm talking about no instrumental value or no instrumental good, which means something that is it's something we pursue for its own sake, something we pursue not because it will bring us something more, not as a tool for achieve another thing, but something we should pursue by its own sake. It's not something that we pursue by its own sake, but it's something that's worth to be pursued by its own sake. This axiology complements the metaethical framework of the SDCT by providing the contents of value over which divine commands operate, linking what is objectively good with the normative authority that renders it obligatory. In general, perfectionism maintains that no instrumental value resides in the realization of human excellence or virtues, understood as virtues and capacities inherent to the human being. Within the context of the SDCT, the ultimate good for human beings is identified with a life of enrichment and realization, eudaimonia in Greek, achieved through the excellent actualization of one's own nature. This perspective is grounded in the perfectionist functionalism, which holds that the best state of an entity consists in the most complete and excellent development of its proper functions. For human beings, this optional state is called the due good, corresponding to a life of flourishment. Aristotle argues that the distinctive function of human beings is rational activity. Consequently, full realization consists in excellent rational activity, a life that best satisfies the rational preferences of the agent. The connection between perfectionist axiology and the divine command theory is established through the theology of the perfect being, which provides an objective and no arbitrary foundation for value. The theological tradition maintains that being and goodness are coextensive, ens et bonum convertitur. That's why my theory does not commit the naturalist fallacy, because even though I'm appealing to a naturalist view, it's a metaphysical naturalism according to which there is a red value in nature. Nature is value. Nature is good. Everything that is good. The nature is a red axiological. There is no gap between being and value. Being and value are the same. The theological traditions maintain that being and goodness are coextensive. They are the same. It's not that there is a gap that we need to solve. So that everything that exists is a finite way of reflecting God's infinite perfections. That's why everything is good, because everything resembles God's nature, and God's nature is good. The nature of a thing is thus a good or a perfection insofar as it imitates divine attributes. God does not create essence arbitrarily. He knows all possible manifestations of his essence and determines that only certain possibilities come into existence. God cannot create something which does not resemble its nature. Everything God creates needs to resemble God's nature. The SDCT holds that God recognizes rather than invents that doing good that follows from the imitation of his perfections in creation. The good is not based in God's will, but in God's nature, or in God's knowing his nature. So that the do of human nature, daimonia, derives from the manner in which this nature reflects the divine essence. We are rational beings, then our good consists in the flourishment of our rational nature. And this flourishment of our rational nature is called eudaimonia. This is the human good. As God is good and God desires the good of his creation, God desires our flourishment. Adopting this axiology allows the SDCT to integrate objective value, what is good, with normative authority, what is obligatory. God, being essentially good, desires the doing good of all his creatures, insofar, of course, as this good is in accordance with the ultimate good of creation. And divine commands are issued with the purpose of guiding human beings toward for realization, eudaimonia. This divine desires functions as a perfectly rational preference, serving as the ultimate criterion to evaluate the value of actions and the correctness of human preference. According to the theory of divine rational preference, as I already explained it. At the same time, morality is seen as a necessary truth. To it, not even divine will can oppose itself. Thus, God cannot command morally wrong actions, and his commands remain consistent with the doing good that he recognizes. Someone could ask why I still call this divine command theory. If God's commands are not necessarily the direct ground of morality. I would say that there are two reasons why I still call it divine command theory. The first reason is that I believe that divine commands are sufficient condition for moral obligation. And the second reason is because I believe that God still serves as the indirect foundation of morality. Because the primary foundation of morality is the good inherent in human nature. But human nature reflects the nature of God if he exists. God becomes the indirect foundation of moral obligation. There is no morality in the sense without God, if God exists, because God is the source of value of creation. Um, since God, through his rational preference, desires the good of all creatures, he desires human flourishment. And consequently, his commands, let me go back to the part we were. And consequentially, God's commands, uh, let me see where we are. His commands are current with his good, which forms part of the rational and natural order of the world. He desires flourishment, and consequently, his commands are current with his this good. Let's talk now about the last component of the synthetic divine command theory, which is the natural law theory. I will uh, appeal to a promulgation-based natural law theory. The natural law theory based on promulgation constitutes the 60 essential components of the synthetic divine command theory, offering a solution to one of the greatest challenges faced by the divine command theory, the problem of epistemic accessibility and the universality of moral commandments. The SDCT maintains that although The authority of moral obligation derives from God. The content of this morality is accessible to human reason, allowing moral principles to be recognizable by all rational agents. Traditionally, DCT and natural law theory, NLT, have been regarded as opposing positions. While NLT holds that universal and immutable moral principles exist, knowable for reason and derived from human nature itself, SDCT proposes a reconciliation of these perspectives. God remains the ultimate authority of moral obligation, provides sufficient reasons for ethical actions through his commands. At the same time, promulgation-based NLT asserts that these divine commandments can be rationally accepted, making them manifest and comprehensible to all rational agents. I don't believe that the best way to know God's will is reading the Bible. I don't believe that the best way to know God's will is praying and waiting for a divine light. I believe the best way to know God's will is by reason itself, because moral truths are grounded in human nature, in human reason. In this way, natural law functions as a medium through which God's commands, his prescriptive will, becomes known and applicable. As DDT transforms what is good, the axiological content, into dirty, the deontological content, ensuring morality is both objective and rationally accessible. The integration of promulgation guarantees that morality is accessible to all rational agents, regardless of explicit belief in God or special religious revelation. SDCT adopts the perspective of the theory of the dictates of reason, considering that practical reason alone is sufficient to ground moral normativity. As I said, if someone asks me, why should I do the right thing? I can give two possible answers. I can say, you need to do what's right because reason requires you this. Then this is a sufficient reason. Another sufficient reason is to say that you need to do what's right because God requires it. Then both reasons are sufficient but not necessary reasons. This distinction allows SDCT to address the classic objection of the virtuous atheist. An atheist can possess sufficient justification for moral living through natural reason alone. Divine command accepted through natural law merely complements this moral normativity for believers. As the city recognizes multiple mechanisms through which divine commands can be promulgated and made dividing for rational agents. According to Richard Moe, these means include natural law, which is about basic moral principles inscribed in human constitution and knowable for reason, moral conscience, an internal factor that aids in discerning right from wrong, social institutions, structures such as family, customs, and civil laws that convey moral norms. It doesn't mean that all social institutions or moral or civil laws are correct. Special revelation, if you believe in one. I don't believe in any special revelation, but if I believed another way to access this truth would be through sect quests or religious traditions. And individual revelations, personal experience such as dreams or spiritual convictions. Uh, Particularly, I adopt the number one as the most trustworthy way to know what's right and wrong. Therefore, the synthetic divine command theory is an integrated metaethical approach that unifies what's morally good with what's obligatory, grounds ultimate value and moral obligation in rational divine preference. Within this framework, cognitivist expressivism explains that SDCT's moral judgments combine true beliefs about moral facts with appropriate attitudes to right divine authority, while non-naturalist non-realism ensures that these judgments are objective and reducible truths. Analogous to logical laws, yet nor derivative from natural properties. Theistic projectivism, in turn, links moral evaluation to responses projected in accordance with God's rational preference, thereby conferring normative authority on moral judgments. Together, these elements function within SDCT to connect the cognitive and expressive dimensions of moral judgment with the objective grounding and divine authority that render moral obligation. Moderate theological voluntarism maintains that divine commands are a sufficient but not necessary condition for moral obligation, distinguishing between necessary commands, derivative from God's essentially good nature, and contingent commands, dependent on institutions established by Him, thus preserving the non-arbitrary character of morality. Aristotelian perfectionist axiology defines the ultimate good, eudaimonia, as the full flourishing of human nature through rational excellence, linking moral value to the realization of human essence as a reflection of divine perfection. Promulgation-based natural law theory ensures that these divine commands are epistemically accessible to all rational agents, whether through reason, conscience, social institution, or special revelation. Metaphorically, SDCT can be seen as a GPS, where human flourishing represents the final destination. Necessary strict functions as the unchanging map, and divine commands provide the authority and obligation to follow the route. It is also like an orchestra, in which the theory of rational divine preference acts as the conductor, while non-naturalist non-realist constitutes the universal score of moral truths that must be followed. Of course, I'm still developing this theory. Uh, it doesn't mean that I already have all the answers. That is the final version of my theory. I still need to understand more the relationship between the components. I still need to refine some propositions, some statements. But I hope you like it. Don't forget to like the video in the bottom below. Don't forget to subscribe yourself to the channel, to turn on the bell to receive notifications of new videos. And thank you. Let me know your comments. Do you have some suggestions to improve my research? Do you think you would disagree or agree with some thesis I presented here? Do you think I should modify some parts of my theory? And see you next time.